Okay, so I don't own an anamorphic lens. I've used a few different ones for various projects, but I don't actually have one of my own. And sometimes I kind of wish I did so that I could throw it on my camera to get some more interesting looking images for the videos that I make. So in this one, I want to try to use some DaVinci Resolve features and editing techniques to see if I can make the footage shot with a standard spherical lens look anamorphic. It's not going to be perfect, but I think it will be fun to try and see how close I can actually get to that sort of look. Alright, first of all, one of the main features of anamorphic lenses is that they squeeze the image horizontally while you're filming, and then when you de-squeeze it in post, you end up with a wider field of view. So for example, the footage from a 35mm anamorphic lens would look wider than the footage from a 35mm spherical one. For a while, I've been filming most of my videos on the Tamron 17-70 at 17mm, and that's what I'm filming this on right now. But if I wanted it to look like I shot this on anamorphic, I would need to go wider. So I would either have to push the camera back or zoom out on the lens. And I can't really do either of those because I've got no more room to move the camera further back, and 17mm is as wide as this lens will go. So I'm actually going to swap over to my Sigma 10-18 and I'm going to go a little bit wider with that one. Alright, I think I like this, and we are at around 12mm right now, and as you can see, the frame that we're working with is a lot wider, which is why you can see my microphone above me. So I'm sorry if that breaks your immersion, but we're gonna do a couple of things to fix that in a second. So now we can hop into Resolve and see what we can do to this footage to try and give it a bit more of an anamorphic look. So this is the clip we're gonna be working with, and the first thing we need to look at is getting the correct aspect ratio. When it comes to working with anamorphic footage, one of the most commonly used aspect ratios is going to be 2.39:1. There are a few other ones that you can use, but you're probably going to see that one in most cases. Typically, to set up that aspect ratio correctly, you would want to go into your timeline settings and then change your resolution to the correct numbers depending on if you're exporting in 1080p or 4K. Then when you bring in the anamorphic footage, you de-squeeze it, and later when you export your final video, you make sure to set up the export resolution to be the same one as your timeline. That should then give you the black bars at the top and the bottom that you've probably seen in most anamorphic videos out there. But because we are working with a spherical lens and not a real anamorphic one, I am going to do things a little bit differently. First, I'm going to go into my effects and I'm going to drop an adjustment clip above our footage. You can do everything we're about to do directly on the clip itself, but having it on an adjustment layer means that you can extend it over more than one clip and have the effects that we're going to apply on all of them. So after that, I'm going to go up to the view drop down menu, and under safe area, I'm going to turn that on. And then I want to go back into the view drop down, select aspect ratio, and click 2.35:1. It's not exactly 2.39:1, but it's close enough for this example. And then I can click on the adjustment clip, go into the inspector, and under cropping, I'm going to work with the sliders for crop top and crop bottom. So I'm going to zoom into this clip by a lot, and I'm only paying attention to the very outside marker, and I just want to line up the crop with that. Then if we go back to full screen, I can just look at this number and write the same thing in the crop top section, and now the cropping at the top and at the bottom is going to be even, and I can go ahead and turn off the safe areas just to see what we're doing. At this point, I can click on the clip itself and move it around a bit to make sure that I get the framing that I want, and I think something like that should be good. Next thing I want to do is add some lens distortion around the edges. This is something that you will notice on almost every anamorphic lens to some degree. It's where the lines in your footage become less straight the further out you go towards the edges of the frame. Now, there's two types of distortion: barrel distortion and pincushion distortion. Barrel distortion is where your image is bowing outwards towards the edges of the frame, and pincushion distortion is where the lines are bowing in towards the middle of the frame. On some newer anamorphic lenses, it's common to have pincushion distortion, while on older ones you'll typically have barrel distortion. And I personally think pincushion distortion looks weird, so I'm going to be adding some barrel distortion to this clip, but it's a personal preference thing. There are a few ways to do it, but the one I like using and think is the easiest is by using the lens correction slider in the inspector panel. This is normally used for correcting distortion, but in some cases, like this one, you can use it to do the opposite as a creative effect. Just keep in mind that this is the only thing that you need to do specifically on the clip itself, because it won't do anything if you use it on the adjustment layer. So I'm going to pull it to the left, which adds barrel distortion, and if you pull it to the right, it's going to add pincushion distortion, but that is up to you. So something like this looks good to me. You don't want to go too far when doing this, or things might start looking weird. As you can see, the side of the shelf on the left is now slightly warped, which is what I'm going for. But along with that, if I turn the lens correction on and off, you'll see that it also makes me slightly bigger in the frame. And that's why I'm saying not to push it too much, because if you have a person in the frame, it can end up distorting them way too much, and it can make things look really goofy. So that's why you want to be kind of subtle with it. Next, I'm going to go into the color tab and add a few effects to the footage. Something that's pretty common with a lot of anamorphic lenses is that the sharpness falls off as you move away from the middle of the frame. So we're going to try to recreate that. Again, I want to make sure that I am applying these to the adjustment clip and not the footage itself, because if I want to use these on other clips, I can just extend the adjustment one. I've talked about these effects that we're going to use in a previous video, which you can check out, but I'm going to start by going into the power window section, and I'm going to make a circular window. I'm going to make it a lot bigger, and I am also going to make it softer, and I'm also going to invert it. And then from the effects library, I am going to drag the radial blur onto that node. You can use any of the other blur effects here as well, but I think the radial one gives you a look that's the closest to something from an anamorphic lens. And then it's just a matter of tweaking the settings until I get something that's noticeable, but not too overwhelming. And I think something like that looks good. So if we go full screen and if I turn it off and then on, I think that should be all right. Now I'm going to make another node after this one and create another power window just like the last one. I can't see it right now, so I got to make sure to go here and select power window under the preview. Again, just got to make it a little bit bigger, make sure to make it softer. Maybe make it even bigger, and I'm gonna invert it again, but this time I'm gonna use it to add a vignette. A lot of anamorphic lenses create a vignette around the edges of the frame, and it can be more or less noticeable depending on what camera sensor you're using them with. So I'm going to go into the curves panel, I'm gonna drop a point somewhere in the middle here, and I'm gonna pull it down a bit. And now if I need to, I can go back into the power window section and then adjust this however I like. But again, if I go full screen, I think this looks pretty good when I turn it off and on again. And as one final touch, I'm going to make another node with the same type of power window. I'm going to make it bigger, make sure that it's a lot softer, and I'm going to invert it. And I'm going to use the prism blur effect on it to try and simulate some chromatic aberration, which isn't exclusively a thing with anamorphic lenses, but I think it adds a bit to the overall effect. Again, I'm just going to tweak the settings to make sure that it's not too strong. And if we go full screen and turn it off and on, it's very subtle, but it's there and I like it. All right, so it's time for an ad read, but don't skip ahead because I want to compare what my footage typically looks like for these videos versus what it looks like with all of the stuff that I've done so far. So we're going to go back and forth between the two while I thank the sponsor of this video, which is Motion VFX. Now, I've been using products from Motion VFX for over a year in almost every single video I've made. Not just for the content that I share on YouTube, but for my client work as well. And I'm always happy to partner up with them because I genuinely trust them, and I really do think the stuff they offer is awesome. Their plugins have given me pretty much everything I've needed when it comes to stuff like titles, motion graphics, and effects. And regardless of what type of project you're working on, I'm pretty sure that their platform always has something that can end up helping you speed up your editing workflow. They've been supporting the channel for a really long time and have helped it grow by allowing me to keep making the stuff that I want to make in a way that's sustainable. So if you also want to support me, a good way of doing it is by supporting my sponsors like Motion VFX. So if you're looking for easy to use video editing assets that look good while also saving you time, check out Motion VFX through the link in my description, and also make sure to use my code to get yourself a discount. Again, thank you to Motion VFX for sticking with me. Alright, I think that looks decent. It's not gonna fool anyone who knows what a real anamorphic lens looks like, but if you don't exactly know what to look for on its own, it's pretty good. There are a few other things that anamorphic lenses are known for, like the flares that they produce when there's a strong light source in the frame, as well as the oval bokeh. And as far as the flares, there are a few built-in resolve effects that could give you that sort of result if you take the time to set them up properly, but the bokeh is going to be a lot harder to recreate. In Resolve 19, they added a new effect called background defocus, which has an anamorphism slider that sort of does this. But if you want to use that, you need to also use the magic mask and track it, which means that you need to have a pretty decently powerful computer. And even though technically there are ways to do both of those things in post, it's going to be pretty difficult, and I would say in most cases it's not going to be worth the time. Plus, the average person is most likely not even going to look for those things in your video, so it probably doesn't even matter. So getting the anamorphic look in post isn't the best way of doing it, but it is gonna be way cheaper than getting a real anamorphic lens. Is it something that I'm gonna do often? Probably not. If you want to shoot anamorphic, just getting a real anamorphic lens is gonna be the better option. Even though the stuff that I showed you in this video could be fun to give your footage a more interesting look, it's not a replacement for the real thing. Like, the techniques that I used can give your footage very general anamorphic characteristics, but there's a lot more that goes into a real lens. This is more something that I would just do for fun every now and then. Or I guess if you have a quick shot that wasn't filmed with an anamorphic lens, but you needed to look like it was, these techniques could be useful. So I think that's it for this one. If you've got any suggestions about how I could have done things differently, and I will see you in the next one.